Beneath the endless Arizona sky, where twilight painted the plains in molten copper and liquid gold, there lived a man whose solitude was so deep it seemed stitched into the fabric of the land itself. His name was John, a farmer whose days were measured in furrows ploughed and fences mended, whose nights were marked by the glow of his pipe and the cold hush of stars scattered like shards of glass across the heavens. From a distance, his life appeared strong and steady, but if one stepped closer, close enough to hear the silence of his rooms, to feel the heavy stillness that clung to his walls, there was a hunger that no bread, no harvest, no cattle could fill. It was the hunger of the heart, the ache of a soul that longed for warmth, yet had learned to endure without it. It was on such a night, when the desert winds carried whispers of secrets across the dunes, that something stirred the monotony of his existence. At first, John thought it was a trick of the eye, a shadow rolling over the horizon, a wandering coyote searching for scraps. But the shape drew nearer, fragile and human, staggering with the weight of exhaustion. His chest tightened as he watched her approach, dust tangled in her long black hair, clothes torn by some journey that must have been filled with struggle, eyes dark pools of silence and pain. She swayed as if the earth itself might give way beneath her, and before she could collapse fully, John was already striding across the cracked soil, arms reaching instinctively, catching her as one might catch something precious before it shatters. He carried her inside his home, a space that had never known another heartbeat but his own. For years, the house had echoed with emptiness, yet tonight the silence was pierced by the faint sound of her breath. He laid her upon the cot by the window, where the last rays of sunset poured in like liquid fire, and he bent low to offer her water. Her lips trembled as she drank, and for the first time in countless seasons, John felt the quiet surge of purpose, of being needed. It was not dramatic, not thunder nor lightning, but it was healing, like the first drop of rain upon parched earth. For hours he remained nearby, not speaking, not pressing, just ensuring her comfort. Outside, the desert howled, but inside his walls something softer bloomed, a fragile peace, a whisper that the home he thought condemned to loneliness had just been reborn. When she stirred again, her voice trembled on broken English words, offering him a name: Nellie. The sound was foreign yet tender, and in it he heard a story untold, fragments of loss, shadows of survival. He asked nothing further. Trust was not demanded. It was nurtured, like a seed pressed into soil that would bloom only under patience and care. In the days that followed, the transformation was almost imperceptible at first, like dawn stealing quietly across a darkened horizon. She grew stronger, and with each careful gesture, the blanket he placed across her shoulders, the bread he broke to share with her, the quiet way she sat across from him at supper, his home gathered warmth like embers catching fire. The loneliness he had carried for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by the healing rhythm of companionship. And though neither spoke of it aloud, both knew. Their lives had shifted the moment she stepped across his threshold. Perhaps, dear soul, listening to this tale, you too have known that hush of longing, the ache of silence that begs to be filled with laughter, or with the steady heartbeat of another beside you. Stories like John and Nellie's remind us that love often arrives quietly, unannounced, disguised as fate or accident, yet it carries the power to heal even the most barren of places. If this moment has touched your heart, if you feel the echo of your own yearning mirrored in these words, I gently invite you, leave a comment to share your thoughts, a simple gesture that makes this space feel more alive. Let your presence be known, like her presence transformed his solitude. And should you wish to journey further into this healing story, where warmth overcomes loneliness and love blooms in unlikely soil, do consider subscribing. Each like, each small support is not just for the story, but for the spirit behind it, fueling the continuation of tales meant to bring comfort, hope, and light. Together, we weave not just a narrative, but a circle of belonging. For in the end, as John would soon discover, no heart is meant to endure the desert alone, and yours, too, deserves to find its oasis. The days stretched forward, and with them, new rhythms of life began to form. Morning broke across the desert like a hymn sung in colors, the horizon washed in pale rose and gold, shadows of mesquite trees stretching long over the waking earth. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with the quiet sound of breathing, two rhythms instead of one, and it felt as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening, holding. John rose early, as he always did, the habits of years guiding his steps, boots on, kettle set over the fire, hands rough but steady as he prepared for another day of labor. Yet now, when he turned, he saw her resting in the cot, strands of dark hair spilling across her cheek like ink on paper, and something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he moved more gently, as though every sound might disturb the fragile miracle that had been placed in his care. When she stirred, her eyes opened slowly, carrying with them not fear this time, but a quiet searching. He offered her a small smile, awkward but sincere, and placed a cup of water by her side. She took it with trembling fingers, whispering a soft thank you, the word shaped imperfectly, yet filled with more gratitude than any polished sentence could have conveyed. That single syllable seemed to ripple through the air like a prayer, a healing balm that eased the silence between them. He nodded, returning to his chores, but his thoughts lingered on the way her voice had sounded, delicate, resilient, alive. By midday, she had found the strength to sit up fully, her posture no longer that of one who feared the world would crush her, but of one testing her place within it. John returned from the field with a pail of water, sweat streaking his brow, and paused at the doorway when he saw her standing, fragile but determined, brushing the dust from her dress. Their eyes met, and though no words passed, the exchange was clear. She was no longer just a guest in his house. She was beginning, piece by piece, to belong. He taught her the names of simple things in English, the cup, the chair, the bread, and in return she murmured their Apache names, each word like a thread weaving into the air between them. Sometimes she laughed when he mispronounced a sound, the warmth of it breaking over him like sunlight, and he found himself laughing too, his voice rusty with disuse but loosening, softening. That laughter, fragile and fleeting at first, grew into something steady, a rhythm that stitched their days together. Evenings were filled with the glow of lamplight, his stories of the land spoken in a low, rumbling voice, her careful words adding color and life, two languages overlapping like the meeting of rivers. Neighbors began to notice changes they could not quite name. Passing by the farm, they saw John straighter in his stance, his movements touched with quiet energy. They noticed smoke curling from the chimney more often, the faint hum of a woman's voice rising like healing music into the open air. and though questions flickered behind their eyes, they respected the mystery, sensing that something sacred was unfolding within those walls. Inside, the transformation was undeniable. The table that had long been set for one now bore 2 bowls, 2 cups, meals shared in silence, punctuated by smiles and soft conversation. The fire that once seemed like a necessity against the desert chill now became a centerpiece, its glow reflecting not just off wood and stone, but off 2 faces softened by companionship. John found himself lingering over simple things, the sound of her footsteps across the wooden floor, the way her fingers lingered on the rim of a cup, the hum she carried with her as she ground cornmeal or folded cloth. These small details, almost invisible on their own, gathered together into something radiant, the return of life into a place that had forgotten how to breathe. One afternoon, as he mended a fence beneath the wide expanse of sky, Nellie walked toward him with a bucket of water. Her stride was steadier now, her shoulders no longer bent beneath exhaustion, and when she set the bucket down beside him, their hands brushed briefly as she passed him a nail. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it carried a weight neither could ignore. A current of recognition passed between them, silent but undeniable, like the desert earth trembling at the promise of rain. He glanced at her, and though neither spoke, both knew a bond was forming, not rushed, not forced, but natural, like seeds sprouting in spring after long months of barrenness. At night, the farmhouse no longer echoed with emptiness. Instead, it breathed with the sound of her songs, soft tunes in her native tongue, melodies filled with memory and spirit. John listened with reverence, his heart opening like parched soil to water, realizing that what he heard was more than music. It was healing, the kind that mended not only silence, but sorrow. Sometimes, when words failed them, their eyes met across the flicker of the fire, carrying truths deeper than any language could express. Seasons moved in their quiet rhythm, but within the farmhouse, time felt different, stretched by the weight of newfound companionship. John, once resigned to solitude, found himself smiling without realizing it, pausing in his chores to watch her feed the chickens, or to hear her laugh when the goats tugged at her skirt. He began to wonder if loneliness had been nothing more than a season too, long, harsh, and unyielding, but still only a season, destined to pass when warmth returned. The land itself seemed to reflect this change. Crops grew sturdier, animals thrived, and neighbors remarked that his farm had not looked so alive in years. John said little in reply, for he knew the truth was not in the soil or the rain, but in the quiet companionship that had taken root beside him. His home had been healed by presence, his days softened by love that had not yet been named but already carried the weight of promise. And as twilight once again spread its colors across the desert, John sat on the porch, pipe forgotten at his side, watching as Nellie moved inside the house, her silhouette framed by lamplight. The air carried the scent of earth and fire, of bread rising in the oven, of life reborn. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man standing against the wilderness alone. He felt as though he had stepped into a story greater than himself, one that was only beginning to unfold, with her presence shaping every chapter yet to come. The nights ahead held mysteries, but he no longer feared them. He had discovered that even the loneliest desert could bloom when touched by kindness, that healing could arrive not as thunder, but as a quiet knock at the door. And in that truth, as the stars shimmered awake, he felt a deep calm settle within him, guiding him toward the next days, the next moments, the next part of their story together. The days unfolded into a rhythm neither had expected, a cadence stitched together not by words, but by gestures, glances, and the unspoken trust that deepened each sunrise. John found himself watching her in moments when the silence of the land stretched wide, the way Nellie's hands moved steadily as she kneaded dough, the curve of her posture as she drew water from the well, the sound of her voice humming a tune so tender it seemed to carry the essence of the earth itself. It was not grand or dramatic, but it was healing, a gentle balm laid over the years of emptiness that had hollowed his soul. At first, he believed he was imagining it, that the warmth gathering inside him was a fleeting illusion. Yet every time her laughter rose lightly into the air, it dissolved his doubt. It reminded him of rain on parched soil, a promise that life always waits to return, no matter how long the drought. He began to notice the little things, the way her eyes softened when she listened to his stories, the quiet delight that sparked when she learned a new English word, the grace in her movements as if she belonged to the land in a way he had never dared to. Each moment stitched itself into the fabric of his being, until he realized he was no longer the man who sat alone under the stars, longing for something unnamed. Neighbors who passed by could see the change written plainly in him, though he rarely spoke of it. His shoulders no longer sagged beneath the weight of solitude, and his eyes carried a new brightness, a quiet flame that could not be mistaken. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The cattle grazed more peacefully, the chickens clucked contentedly at dawn, as though the farm itself responded to the presence of life that had been missing. The house, once only a structure of wood and stone, had become something more, alive, breathing, echoing with the shared footsteps of two souls learning to belong. One evening, the air warm with the scent of mesquite and firewood, John found himself sitting across from Nellie at the small wooden table. The lamplight flickered, casting soft halos on her face, and he realized that the silence no longer pressed heavily upon them. Instead, it cradled them gently, a silence filled with presence rather than absence. He told her a story from his youth, about the first calf he ever raised, the storm that nearly swept away his father's barn, and though her English was still halting, her laughter rose clear when he mimed his boyish panic. It was a sound that wrapped around his heart, healing in its purity, dissolving the years of loneliness that had become second nature. Over time, their companionship wove itself into something stronger than either had sought. There were no declarations, no grand confessions, only the small things that built trust. The way she placed an extra bowl on the table without needing to be asked, the way he left water by her bedside each morning, the way their hands brushed when they worked side by side, repairing a fence or feeding the animals. Each moment was a thread, and together those threads formed a tapestry richer than anything John had known. He had once thought the desert only offered hardship, but now he understood. It also held the power to cradle love in its vast, unyielding silence. At night, as the fire burned low, she sometimes shared fragments of her own past, memories of mountains standing like guardians over her people, of rivers that whispered songs through the valleys, of her mother's voice carrying lullabies that still lingered in her dreams. John listened with reverence, as if each word were a jewel uncovered from the earth, and in her voice he heard resilience, grace, and the kind of strength born only from surviving both beauty and loss. Her stories sank into him, not as burdens, but as gifts, each one widening his understanding of the woman who now filled his home with quiet warmth. One afternoon, as he worked in the pasture, repairing a post battered by wind, she came to him carrying a bucket of water. The sun struck her hair, turning it into a cascade of dark fire, and when she handed him a nail, their fingers touched. It was such a small thing, yet it trembled through him like a hidden chord struck deep inside. He looked at her, and in that moment the world seemed to pause, the sky stretching infinite above them, the earth steady beneath their feet, their hearts bound in a silence that spoke louder than words. From then on, John noticed that everything felt different. Evenings no longer arrived as endings, but as promises of another day shared. The firelight seemed warmer, the food richer, the stars brighter. Sometimes she sang softly as she worked, her voice carrying healing energy that seeped into every corner of the farmhouse, filling spaces once hollowed by grief. He would pause, simply listening, letting the melody wash over him until he felt whole in a way he had not believed possible. There were doubts, of course, whispers in the back of his mind reminding him of the years between them, of the differences in their worlds. Yet those doubts dissolved each time he caught her looking at him with quiet trust, with eyes that said she saw not just a farmer, but a man who had given her refuge, safety, and a place to breathe again. It was in those moments that he understood. She was not a passing visitor. She was the heart of a new beginning, the one who turned a house into a home, silence into song, loneliness into love. The desert, once a place of isolation, had become a canvas for their shared days, woven with laughter, softened by healing, strengthened by work done side by side. And as the horizon bled into twilight, the farmhouse glowed with something stronger than fire, something more enduring than stone. John had not searched for love, but it had found him nonetheless, arriving quietly in the figure of a woman who now walked his land as if it had always been hers. And though neither spoke of the future aloud, both could feel it building, steady as the dawn that always returned, carrying with it the promise of the next chapter waiting just beyond the horizon. The weeks unfolded with the gentle certainty of the seasons, and in their quiet progression, John began to realize how completely his life had been altered. Where once his days had been carved from silence and monotony, they were now woven with presence, her presence, subtle yet radiant, soft yet unshakable. The farmhouse, which had long stood as a fortress against loneliness, seemed to breathe anew. Morning light spilled across wooden floors and caught in her hair as she worked, and each time John saw it, he felt as though the sun itself had entered his home, carrying warmth not even the fiercest desert dawn had ever given him. She moved with grace that spoke of survival, of endurance, and of a rhythm born from harmony with the earth. At dawn, she fed the chickens, laughter rising when the hens scattered at her feet, her voice floating into the air like healing music that drifted across the fields. By midday, she worked beside him, pulling weeds from the young corn or carrying water, her steps steady on the dusty path. And in the evenings, when the fire glowed low, she sang songs from her childhood, notes tender and haunting, full of memory. John listened, enraptured, realizing that each song carried more than sound. It carried the essence of who she was, her roots, her history, her soul. It was as though she wove invisible threads of belonging around them both, binding their hearts in silence deeper than speech. The land itself seemed to respond to her. The crops rose stronger, greener. The soil felt less barren beneath his hands. He did not voice it, but John believed her presence had blessed the earth in some unspoken way. The cattle grazed more peacefully. The water in the well seemed sweeter, and the house itself smelled of bread once again. Bread he had not tasted in years until she chose to bake. When he entered the kitchen and found the golden loaves cooling on the table, something inside him broke open. A healing flood of memory and longing answered all at once. The table, once a stage for solitude, now held 2 cups, 2 bowls, 2 lives braided together in simplicity yet richness. There were moments when John paused, almost afraid to acknowledge how deeply she had become part of him. Watching her bend over the garden, the sun gilding her figure, or listening to her laughter ripple like water, he wondered if he was dreaming. He had resigned himself long ago to the barren path of solitude, yet now here she was, turning that path into a field blooming with life. It humbled him the way joy could return without warning, as if love itself had been waiting, patient and merciful, for him to open the door. The neighbors noticed the change too. They passed on horseback and remarked on the farmer's straighter stance, the light in his eyes that had not been there before. Some whispered, curious about the young Apache woman who now moved about his farm with such ease. Others simply nodded with quiet respect, sensing that something sacred was unfolding, something that words could not reduce nor judgment diminish. For the first time in many years, John was no longer looked upon as the lonely man on the edge of the desert. He was seen as a man whose life had been touched by grace, whose house now carried laughter, music, and the glow of companionship. Yet even amidst the beauty there were shadows. At times, when the firelight flickered against her face, John would notice the moments when her gaze drifted far away, her eyes deep with memories she did not share. Pain lingered in those silences, the kind that no words could unravel. He did not press her, for he knew healing moved slowly, tender as spring rain over hardened earth. Instead, he offered presence, his quiet company, his listening eyes, the steady rhythm of kindness. And little by little he saw her soften, her silences no longer burdened, but becoming spaces where trust could take root. Their bond grew in the smallest of gestures. The way she reached for the chair across from him at every meal without hesitation, as though it had always belonged to her. The way he set aside an extra cup each morning without thought, as if her place at his table was as natural as the sunrise. The way their hands brushed over tools, over bread, over the everyday fabric of life, carrying more than words could convey. These small acts, so ordinary, became the pulse of something extraordinary. Love forming not through sudden blaze, but through steady flame, through presence that endured. One evening, as the desert sky bled into shades of violet and rose, John sat by the porch while Nellie worked in the yard, gathering herbs she had planted by the fence. He watched her silhouette against the fading light, and his chest ached with a tenderness he could not contain. She looked up, their eyes meeting across the quiet stretch of land, and in that single glance he felt everything: gratitude, belonging, the miracle of having been found when he thought he was lost. For years he had lived as though love had passed him by, but now it was here, living, breathing, walking barefoot across his fields. Night deepened, and when she came inside, placing the bundle of herbs on the table, he felt the truth settle in him like the desert stars above. Steady, eternal, undeniable. She had become the heart of his home, With her, silence was no longer empty. It was full of warmth. With her, the farm was no longer a fortress. It was a sanctuary. With her, his days were no longer a sentence of solitude, but a promise of life shared. The fire crackled low, casting its glow across their faces, and John knew that the story of his life had turned a page. He had not sought it, but love had come, healing, gentle, unwavering, and it carried him forward, toward the horizon of a new tomorrow, where companionship would continue to bloom like wildflowers across the wide and open desert. The morning sun rose over the fields with a brilliance that seemed almost new, spilling across the furrows of earth and draping everything in gold. John stepped out into the crisp air, the familiar weight of his boots pressing against the soil, and yet nothing about his life felt familiar anymore. What had once been a daily march of solitude was now threaded with presence. Her voice humming softly from inside the house, the rhythm of her footsteps as she moved with quiet confidence through the rooms. Each sound echoed not as interruption, but as healing, filling the hollow places he had long believed would never be touched again. Nellie had grown stronger, her frame no longer frail, but alive with energy, her movements steady, her laughter bright. She worked alongside him in the fields, her skirt brushing against the dust as she bent to pluck weeds, her hands unafraid of labor. Sometimes she carried water to where he mended the fences, her eyes catching his in a glance that lingered longer than words could. Other times she tended the garden, coaxing herbs and vegetables from the dry ground with care that seemed almost sacred, as if her touch carried life itself. John would pause in his work just to watch her, his heart swelling with a quiet awe he never thought he would feel again. Evenings became the most cherished hours, when the heat of the day gave way to the softness of twilight. Together they sat at the table, a meal spread between them. Bread warm from the oven, beans simmered gently, fresh herbs filling the air with fragrance. The small table that had once borne only his solitary plate now carried the evidence of companionship, and John often found himself lingering, reluctant to let the moment end. Afterward they would sit by the fire, the flames crackling low, and she would hum songs from her people, her voice carrying a tenderness that melted into the walls, into his chest, into the very marrow of his bones. Sometimes he joined her, stumbling over unfamiliar words, and their laughter braided into the music, weaving something new between them, something fragile, yet unbreakable. There were nights when she shared pieces of her story in halting English. She spoke of the river she had loved as a child, the mountains that had watched over her people, the voice of her mother carrying songs like threads of memory. Her words came slowly, carefully, but John listened with reverence, as though she was offering him jewels dug from the deep earth. He never interrupted, never pressed, simply sat with her in the glow of firelight, knowing that trust was a seed that grew only when tended with patience. And when she fell silent, her eyes drifting to places far away, he offered not questions, but presence, a kind of quiet healing that asked nothing yet gave everything. The farm itself seemed to bloom with their bond. Neighbors passing by remarked that the fields looked richer, the cattle healthier, the house more alive. They noticed John standing taller, the heaviness gone from his eyes, his face marked by a quiet joy. At first there were whispers, curiosity about the young Apache woman who now lived at his side, about the man whose solitude had been broken. But over time, those whispers softened into respect. They saw the way she greeted visitors with shy kindness, the way he treated her with patience and care, and they understood that what bound them was not chance but choice. Together, they had become more than two lives intersecting. They had become a family shaped by trust. John's doubts about age, about difference, about the future, rose from time to time like shadows across the desert. He wondered if she would one day long for something more, if she might tire of the quiet farm, if his weathered hands could truly hold the gift she had brought into his life. But each time those fears crept close, they dissolved with a single glance, a single smile. When she laughed at his stories, when she laid her hand gently over his as they passed bread across the table, when her eyes met his in the stillness of night, with warmth unspoken, he felt the truth settle deep. Her presence was not born of necessity, but of belonging. She was not with him out of need, but out of choice. One evening, as the sky burned crimson and gold, John caught her gaze across the table. In her eyes was gratitude, warmth, and something deeper, something that silenced every doubt. The farmhouse no longer felt like wood and stone. It pulsed with life, with memory, with love. It had become not just a shelter against the wilderness, but a sanctuary built by their hands, by their trust, by the gentle rhythm of two hearts finding one another in the vast silence of the desert. As the fire dimmed and the stars began to scatter across the heavens, John leaned back in his chair, pipe forgotten, watching her silhouette framed by the lantern's glow. He thought of the years that had passed in emptiness, of the weight of loneliness that had nearly buried him, and he felt a quiet awe for the miracle of her presence. He knew then, with certainty, that his life had turned toward something greater than he had ever imagined, a new chapter shaped not by solitude, but by the warmth of companionship. And as the night deepened, he felt the story of them carrying forward, steady as the desert stars, leading them toward the next moment, the next revelation, the next step in the life they were building together. The sun burned high over the fields, yet John barely noticed the weight of its heat upon his back. Life no longer pressed down on him the way it once had, for every burden seemed lighter now that it was shared. He turned his head and saw her there, Nellie, carrying a woven basket as she moved among the rows of corn, her hands steady, her movements sure. The dry wind tugged at her dark hair, lifting it like a banner of freedom, and he felt something stir deep inside, a sense of belonging that healed the silence of his years. She had become part of the rhythm of his land, her presence blending with the pulse of the soil, the call of the birds, the whisper of the desert itself. At first he had worried that she might always feel like a stranger here, caught between the wild vastness of her people's mountains and the narrow lines of his farm. But she proved him wrong in ways that humbled him. She woke early, her footsteps light on the wooden floor, feeding chickens with laughter that made even the animals restless with joy. She gathered herbs, baked bread, tended goats, and when the sun set, she lit the lamp with a grace that made his house glow as though touched by something holy. It was no longer a home built of loneliness. It was a sanctuary woven with care, where silence was softened by her voice and emptiness filled with her warmth. John often caught himself standing still, tools forgotten in his hands, just to listen to her humming as she worked. Her songs rose into the air like healing threads, weaving through the rafters, spilling into the fields, and dissolving into the sky. He did not always understand the words, but he understood the soul within them. They carried resilience, memory, devotion, a living echo of her people and her past. And in listening, he felt himself healed, as though her voice could mend cracks he hadn't known existed inside him. The land mirrored this transformation. Where once his crops had struggled, now they flourished. The corn rose taller, the soil seemed richer, the cattle stronger. Neighbors remarked that fortune had finally come to his farm, though John quietly believed it was not fortune at all, but the blessing of her presence. Even the well water seemed sweeter, as though the earth itself responded to the bond they shared. His days, once repetitive and heavy, now carried lightness. He found joy in the simple act of laboring side by side with her, in seeing her hands stained with the same soil that stained his. And yet, it was not only the farm that was transformed, it was him. Where he had once lived as a man resigned to solitude, he now walked with a quiet pride, his heart fuller than he dared admit. At night, when she sat across from him at supper, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of the fire, he felt gratitude so deep it was almost painful. She had given him more than companionship. She had given him back to himself, awakening a tenderness he thought had died long ago. There were moments, small and fleeting, when the truth of their bond revealed itself. Once, as he mended a fence in the fading light, she knelt beside him, holding the planks steady without being asked. Their hands brushed as she passed him a nail, and though neither spoke, the silence between them thickened with something unspoken, something sacred. Another time, as she baked bread, he entered the kitchen to find her humming softly, her face lit by the glow of the oven. She looked up and smiled, and he felt the world steady beneath his feet, as if that single smile had anchored him more firmly than the land ever had. Not all the moments were easy. Sometimes he saw shadows cross her face, eyes wandering far into memories she did not voice. Pain still lived inside her, pain born from a journey he could not fully know. In those times he offered no questions, no intrusion, only his quiet presence, his steady hands, his patient heart. He knew healing was not something that could be demanded. It was something that grew slowly, like seeds under the soil, nurtured by trust and time. And when she returned from those silences, her smile gentler, her laughter softer, he felt honored to have been her witness. Their lives had become intertwined in ways neither could undo. In the evenings, she sat beside him on the porch, the desert stretching endless before them, stars scattering like diamonds across the black sky. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt the weight of her not as burden, but as gift, grounding him, healing him. In those quiet nights, he no longer feared the years ahead. Loneliness no longer loomed like a shadow. He had been given a new chapter, one shaped by belonging, by trust, by the sacred union of two lives once lost, but now found in each other. The whispers among neighbors softened, replaced by acceptance. They saw how she worked the land, how he treated her with reverence, how their bond radiated in even the smallest gestures. What once seemed unusual became undeniable. Together, they had built a family. John no longer carried the weight of being a solitary farmer. He carried the strength of partnership, the light of companionship, and the healing truth of love quietly rooted in ordinary days. And so the desert, once only a canvas of silence, had become a place of music, of warmth, of belonging. The farmhouse glowed not only with firelight, but with something greater. Love made manifest in the rhythm of shared labor, in the laughter carried on the wind, in the quiet devotion that deepened with every sunrise. John knew then that the life he had once thought would end in solitude was only just beginning, unfolding into something vaster, brighter, and far more beautiful than he had ever dared to imagine. The horizon stretched endless before them, and in its promise lay the next step, the next revelation, the next moment that would carry them deeper into the story they were writing together. The morning unfolded with a hush that seemed almost reverent, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. John was bent low among the young stalks of corn, his hands parting the leaves as he checked for pests, the rhythm of labor steady and familiar. Yet on this day something shifted, something beyond the steady pulse of the earth. From a short distance away, Nellie moved gracefully, a basket balanced on her arm, plucking weeds that threatened the growth of the plants. The air smelled of damp soil, of life breaking through dryness, and the sky above shimmered with the quiet glow of dawn. It was in this stillness, in this simple act of tending the land together, that a word left her lips, soft yet strong, carrying weight beyond its sound. She called out, "Husband!" The world seemed to pause around him. His heart thundered as if the land itself had quaked. The word sank into him, warm and piercing, breaking through walls he had built over long years of solitude. He lifted his head, his gaze locking onto her across the rows of green, and what he saw in her eyes left no space for doubt. She had spoken not from need, not from survival, but from choice. That single word was more than a name. It was a vow, a declaration, a promise spoken in the language of the soul. John felt the ground steady beneath him in a way it never had before, as though the desert itself had affirmed what had always been destined. She stood with her hands full of weeds, her face calm yet radiant, and in her eyes was the quiet certainty of one who had chosen where she belonged. For John, it was as if the years of silence, the nights of emptiness, had dissolved in an instant. That word, husband, was healing, sunlight after storm, water after drought. It wrapped around him with the gentle strength of belonging, reminding him that he was no longer a man bracing against life alone. He had been seen, chosen, named. The rest of the day moved differently, every moment coloured by the echo of that word. He found himself glancing at her, not only as the woman who had once stumbled onto his land, weary and lost, but as the partner who had filled his home with warmth, who had restored his laughter, who had become the other half of his days. Her steps seemed lighter, her voice surer, as though naming him had anchored her as well. Together they moved through the fields, side by side, their silence filled not with absence, but with the richness of understanding. In the evenings, as firelight flickered across the wooden walls, they laughed at the stumbling exchanges of language. Him teaching her English words, her teaching him Apache phrases. Each mispronunciation carried its own joy, each shared laugh binding them closer. Sometimes she sang, her voice flowing like a river, and he sat quietly, letting the music seep into him until his heart felt whole. Other nights they spoke of small things, the weather, the animals, the work to be done. But beneath those simple words ran the deeper current of devotion, steady and undeniable. Seasons passed, and with each change the bond between them grew. Summer's heat scorched the earth, but they endured it together, laboring under the sun with hands that had learned the rhythm of unity. Autumn arrived with a harvest more abundant than John had ever seen, and in the richness of the fields he saw proof that love itself had blessed the soil. Winter nights, once cold and lonely, were now softened by shared blankets, by her head resting against his shoulder, by whispered words in the quiet glow of the hearth. He often wondered if he was dreaming, if a chance meeting could truly have led to such peace, such quiet joy. But when he turned and saw her eyes reflecting the fire, steady with devotion, he knew it was real. The community, too, began to see them differently. At first, there were whispers, uncertainty, about the bond between a weathered farmer and a young Apache woman. But whispers melted as days turned into months. Neighbors saw her kindness, the way she greeted them shyly but warmly. They saw his respect, the tenderness with which he treated her. They saw the farm thriving, the laughter drifting across the fields. And in time, acceptance grew, replacing doubt with quiet admiration. Together, they were no longer an oddity, but a family. John took pride not only in his land, but in the life they were shaping, a life born not of chance, but of trust, resilience, and love. He often thought of the way she had spoken that word, husband, and how it had become more than a moment. It was a truth taking root, deeper each day, until it became the center of his existence. At night, beneath the vast canopy of stars, he turned to her and whispered his gratitude, not in eloquence, but in simple words, that she had given him more than he ever thought possible, that she had transformed his solitude into a home. Her reply was soft, but it settled into his soul with equal weight. "And you gave me a home." In that exchange they understood that they had both rescued each other, each filling the emptiness the other had carried. Together they had rewritten the story of their lives, turning loneliness into belonging, silence into song, survival into love. And as the seasons continued their endless circle, John no longer feared the years ahead. He knew the desert would bring its storms, its droughts, its trials, but he also knew he would not face them alone. For in the sound of her voice calling him husband, he had found not just love, but eternity, an unbreakable bond that would carry them into every dawn, every dusk, every tomorrow yet to come. The desert carried its seasons in silence, yet within the farmhouse life had become a song. Days bled into one another with the rhythm of work and tenderness, each morning beginning not with loneliness, but with the sound of her voice, soft as prayer, weaving through the air. John woke to the scent of bread baking, to the scrape of her footsteps moving across the wooden floor, to the sight of her figure framed by sunlight as she opened the door to greet the dawn. She had transformed everything, his home, his land, his heart, until he could no longer remember what it felt like to live in emptiness. Together they endured the shifting of the desert's moods. In the heat of summer, sweat beading across their brows, they worked side by side in the fields, pausing only to share a drink from the same cup, laughter spilling between them like water cooling the tongue. In autumn, they gathered a harvest richer than John had ever seen, baskets brimming with corn, beans, and squash. the air filled with the scent of Earth's generosity. Winter, once his enemy, no longer haunted him. They sat close by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, her songs weaving warmth into nights that had once been unbearable. And when spring returned, the land was alive with renewal, mirroring the new life they had built together, fragile yet strong, delicate yet enduring. Neighbors who once passed his farm with pity now came with smiles, greeted by her kindness and his quiet pride. They saw the bond that needed no explanation, the way she spoke his name, the way he listened to her laughter, the harmony in their shared labor. What had begun in whispers of doubt became, in time, a story of respect, for love was its own answer. No one could deny that this house, once silent, now pulsed with life, with joy, with the healing truth of companionship. In the evenings, when the sky turned to copper and stars spilled across the heavens, they sat on the porch side by side. Sometimes they spoke of the future, sometimes of the past, but more often they simply sat in silence, letting the presence of one another speak louder than words. He traced the curve of her hand with his rough fingers, marveling that such softness had chosen to rest in him. She leaned into his strength, finding in him the home she thought she had lost. They were not bound by ceremony or papers, but by choice, by love spoken in everyday acts, the cup refilled without asking, the hand offered when the earth felt heavy, the smile shared across a table set for two. John often thought back to the man he had been before her arrival, the weight of years spent alone pressing into his bones. That man seemed like a ghost now, someone half forgotten, someone healed by the touch of her laughter, the grace of her presence. She had filled his life with light so steady that even the shadows felt gentler, and he in turn had offered her a sanctuary, a place to root her heart again, a soil where trust could grow deep and enduring. They had rescued each other in ways neither had expected. He had given her a home, but she had given him more. The gift of being seen, of being named, of being loved. He had offered her bread and shelter, and she had answered with devotion and song. Together, they had found wholeness, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet constancy of two lives entwined. And as twilight deepened, John knew he no longer feared the passing of time. Loneliness would never again be his companion. Instead, he carried with him the sound of her voice, calling him husband, the sight of her eyes reflecting firelight, the healing weight of her hand in his. Each day was no longer just a survival of hours, but a continuation of a love story that had taken root in barren soil and flourished into abundance. Their life was not perfect, but it was theirs. It was written in the dust of the desert, in the rhythm of harvest and hearth, in the music of her laughter and the steady beat of his heart. And for John, that was enough. Not just enough, but everything. If this story has touched something inside you, if it has reminded you of love's quiet strength or the healing power of companionship, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice add warmth to this circle, just as Nellie's presence filled John's home with light. And if you wish to walk with me through more stories of love, hope, and renewal, I warmly ask you to like this tale, subscribe for the next chapters to come, and let us keep weaving together a place where hearts can find their healing. For just as John discovered, no one is meant to walk the desert alone. and your presence here brings life to this journey too.